All right. Welcome, folks, again to another reading hour. It's the reading hour for July 31st, 2025. All right. We're rolling. So let's get started. We will get started with the Gladio book. All right. So this next section here is Wolves and Babas. Abu Zer or Ugurlu. I'm not messing these up as far as I can tell. These are just difficult names. So Abu Zer Ugurlu, Bekir Salenk, and Hussein Sil were gray wolves. Okay, so these are like Turkish names. That makes sense. Were gray wolves and leading Babas were members of the Turkish underworld with strong ties to the MIT. So the MIT, what was that? The military, the Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı, the National Intelligence Organization of Turkey. Okay, so these guys were gray wolves. They had strong ties to the MIT. Ugurlu, the hulking, shaven-headed, hard-eyed, quote, boss of all bosses, kept a crew of professional killers at his beck and call, including Mehmet Ali Agca, who later would shoot and nearly kill Pope John Paul II. By 1975, according to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, he controlled a multi-billion-dollar contraband operation, partly financed by the sale of narcotics. Bekir Salenk, unlike Ugurlu, had few rough edges. Smooth and worldly, he was fond of sexy women, good cigars, and baccarat, and served as the frontman for the contraband enterprise. Okay, so they had the thug, and then they had the presentable, charismatic frontman. Makes sense, actually. Sorry, let me put my captions on here. That way I can give people the link to the books. Pop up the chat on the screen. All right, and then we're back to... By 1975, Salenk was the owner of a fleet of ships registered in Panama and the chain of hotels. The mustachioed and sullen Hussein Sil represented the brains of the operation. A skilled accountant who spoke fluent Italian, he developed business contacts in Naples and Milan, which came to include leading members of the Camorra. These contacts granted him entry to Roberto Calvi, the head of Banco Ambrosiano, and in turn to Archbishop Marcinkus of the IOR. Okay, so he's making all these connections with the top mafiosos / Vatican officials. At the close of 1975, Ugurlu, Salenk, and Sil sent Sammy Duruos to Sicily under orders to make a deal regarding the opium they were now controlling from the Golden Crescent. The Babas awaited their emissary's return in a small Yugoslav town near the Italian border. When Duruos showed up with the news that he had failed to come to terms with Salvatore Rina and Bernardo Provenzano of the Corleonesi clan, the Babas clubbed him to death, leaving his body in a Yugoslav hotel room. Within a year, they sent Kevdet Sil, Hussein Sil's brother, as their new emissary to the dons of the Sicilian Commission. By this time, the situation in Southeast Asia was worsening for the drug trade, and the two parties came to a preliminary agreement. So if we remember, I'm pretty sure it was because of the Vietnam War that there were a lot of places that were previously the harvesting grounds for opium, the source of most of the opium that was trafficked in the world by these mafias working with the Freemasons, the Vatican, and the CIA, the DEA, and, what were they calling them? Air America. They had another name before it was called that. So most of that heroin was coming from Southeast Asia, but then when that was becoming a chaotic and, heavily bombed area, Cambodia, Laos, all those places, then they had to shift to Pakistan, Afghanistan, other places in Asia, just further away. So this next section here is Grand Hotel. In 1977, meetings between the Babas and the Dons were held at the Hotel Vitosha in Sofia, Bulgaria. The Turks were represented by Ugurlu, Salenk, and the Sil brothers, and the Italians by Rafael Cutolo, the capo of the Camorra. They were also represented by Michele Zaza, the head of a Sicilian crime family and a Camorra deputy, Luciano Leggio, Salvatore Rina, and Bernardo Provenzano of the Corleonesi clan, and Nito Santa Paola, and the Ferrar brothers from Catania. So a whole bunch of wops here. Most of the Italian men of respect at the meetings were members of P2, and all were bound by a pact they made in Naples regarding the new drug deal. The Hotel Vitosha was an ideal place for the crime clan gatherings. The modern 30-story resort boasted a bowling alley, a sauna, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, several bars, and a panoramic restaurant. Chic boutiques charging Paris prices, prostitutes, quote, licensed for foreigners, and a gambling casino featuring blackjack and roulette. The tab for the get-togethers was paid by Kintex, an official arm of the Bulgarian government. Yeah, so that's cool. You get to have these like fancy getaways. You have prostitutes, gambling, bowling alley, all the stuff you could want right there in the hotel, and it's all paid for by the government, by the literal deep state. This next section here is drugs for arms. Kintex was formed in 1968 by top-ranking members of the Bulgarian Security Service. Its primary function was trafficking in illegal arms for right-wing Turkish groups, including the Grey Wolves, the Palestine Liberation Organization in Lebanon. Oh, okay. And the government of Israel, also playing both sides quite literally. With the opening of the drug route from the Golden Crescent, it became the first outfit to offer morphine base as a payment. The firm was used extensively by NATO and the CIA. In one typical Kintex deal, 459 rocket launchers and 100,000 missiles were shipped in May 1977 from the Black Sea port of Burgas in a Kintex freighter under Cypriot colors. The vessel was skippered by a Greek captain. The customer of the provenance of the munitions appeared to be a NATO naval base, and the probable customer was Israel. Dwayne Dewey Claridge served as the CIA station chief in Ankara at the time of the meetings. He allegedly worked with the Grey Wolves and Kintex and became a key figure in the arms for drug business. He should have been aware of the activities taking place at the Hotel Vitosha and the alliance being forged between the Babas and the Dons, even though he makes no mention of this development in his book, A Spy for All Seasons. After the new drug network was established, he became the station chief in Rome, where he remained until the attempted hit on John Paul II. In accordance with the final agreement, the Capos agreed to pay the Babas for the morphine with shipments of arms, including Leopard tanks, Cobra helicopters fully loaded with rockets and guns, and RPG-7 rocket launchers. The Turks could then sell the arms to insurgent groups throughout Poland, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. These munitions were provided by the CIA from NATO arsenals in Western Europe and from Horst Grillmeyer, a German arms dealer who worked for the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, the Germany Secret Service. I'm not apologizing for fucking up the German. Don't care. The arms trafficking would be managed by Kintex in Bulgaria. So cool. It's just like more quite literal Gladio operations like we'd always seen before. So they're probably taking some of those arms originally used for the stay-behind organizations, probably some of those original arms caches they were storing around Europe, probably just shifting some around for their new operations here. This next section here is called Drug Hub. The operation at the start was tightly run, with Milan as its hub. The heroin base was smuggled into Italy by ethnic Albanians via the Balkan route, which ran from Bulgaria through Kosovo and into Albania, Greece, and Yugoslavia. The route continued to Milan, where Salah al-Din Wakas and Kahim Nasser, intermediaries for the Babas, had set up warehouses. The product was picked up at these locations by Nunzio Lamartina and Antonio Totolo in TIR, Transport International Routiers, trucks, and it was in TIR trucks, and conveyed to nearby ports for shipment to the Sicilian port of Catania. In Sicily, it passed into the hands of Giuseppe Calderone and Nito Santapaola, who trucked the morphine to laboratories owned by the Gaetano brothers and operated by Gerlando Albertini and his team of Corsican chemists. Hold on just 1 second here. Just making sure. Oh my god. The bots are back. Sorry, guys. Once refined, the heroin was loaded on freighters and shipped to the United States by Stibam International, or Stibam, it's S-T-I-B-A-M. So Stibam International, a Milan-based shipping firm. Stibam was located at Via Oldofredi, number 2, a building owned by Banco Ambrosiano. The firm was headed by 67-year-old Henry Arsan, known as the, quote, Playboy Mafiosi. Fond of gaudy clothes, gold chains, and loose women, the mysterious Arsan, whom various sources identified as either Syrian or Armenian, wore many hats, including that of a CIA operative. Another leading principal in Stibam was General Giuseppe Santovito, the head of Italy's military intelligence agency and prominent P2 member. Santovito, who played a part in the Moro kidnapping, was later responsible for expunging all traces of the Turkish mafia's presence in St. Peter's Square after the Pope was shot. Almost overnight, Steinbum became a multi-billion-dollar concern, providing drugs to the American mafia and arms to a vast array of clients, including AK-47 rifles for the Nicaraguan Contras and American missiles for the Khomeini regime in Iran. One of the most spectacular of the Steinbum undertakings involved its sale of thermonuclear weapons to an Arab nation, believed to have been either Syria or Saudi Arabia. This operation involved Glauco Partel, described in the Italian press as being a, quote, missile expert who worked for, quote, the National Security Administration, and Eugene Bartolomeus, a U.S. intelligence veteran who served the CIA at the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. See, I guess I'll have to have, like, Jared on sometime to talk more about the Nugan Hand Bank. I don't know if it has much particularly to do with Australia or if they just happen to have a branch there or what, but this next section here is one-stop snooping. CIA officials and former spooks such as Ted Shackley, who worked for private intelligence gathering agencies like Research Associates International, for CIA officials and former spooks. Maybe there was supposed to be a 4 there. Did I just erase that? Sorry, you guys. Oh yeah, so 4 CIA officials and former spooks such as Ted Shackley, who worked for private intelligence gathering agencies like Research Associates International, Milan became a one-stop shopping and snooping center. They could visit Arsene and Selenk at Steinbum and arrange for shipment of arms to the right-wing guerrilla army of the day, check on the latest shipment of heroin to the States, provide Selenk with the latest hit list, receive notification of any problems concerning the Balkan route, and receive the latest list of news from the Grey Wolves in Turkey. After exchanging parting pleasantries, they could walk down the street for a meeting with Calvi, Joly, and Archbishop Marcinkus at Banco Ambrosiano, where they could discuss the activities of the shell companies the Vatican had set up in Panama, the needs of the Christian Democratic Party, the latest developments in the strategy of tension, and the concerns of the clerical couriers who were carrying suitcases stuffed with cash to the IOR. Few who gathered at such conferences were aware that the heady days would soon come to an end. By the end of 1983, Calvi would be found hanging from a bridge in London. Selenk and Jelly would be wanted fugitives, Marcinkus would be a prisoner within Vatican City, and Arsene would be found dead in a jail cell. So I guess I'm trying to think of a way to tie this into the current corrupt dealings of the United States. I was just listening to a TrueAnon podcast episode yesterday, and they're talking about how the money laundering that's happening now, either through people manipulating the actual currency of the United States, like the dollar, by threatening a Trump policy and then rolling it back immediately and then taking advantage of the stock swings that are happening as a result. Like they describe a situation in which the US dollar started tanking and then regaining ground all within a span of a couple hours. And a lot of people could get fabulously wealthy in that span of a couple hours if they know ahead of time that such an event is going to happen or just be threatened to happen and then immediately get rolled back. So the taco thing, Trump always chickens out, is actually incredibly clever if you don't actually care about your reputation and what you care about is making money off of stock swings. And so what they were saying is that the money laundering that's happening now between that kind of thing and also with the incorporation of crypto into the U.S. government and the U.S. financial system at an unprecedented scale. They also mentioned how you can use crypto holdings as collateral for putting a down payment on a house now or to build up a credit score. Like crypto is being incorporated into the U.S. economy in an official way. And a lot of people didn't think that would happen. A lot of people are still pissed that it's happening because it's happening in such a very obviously corrupt and what do you call it? Just I don't know what other word for it there is other than corrupt. It's just like blatant corruption. Yeah, you can Venmo the U.S. to pay off their debt now if you want to. But this is all just to say that sometimes there is still infighting within these groups and people do wind up dead. But that's just to say the only way that kind of thing happens, the only way that these people are held accountable is when other deep state agencies fight with each other. And they do it this way. They put out hits on each other. It's not like there's a lot of people who are holding these people accountable from the working class, The heroin boom is the next section here. But in 1979, business was booming. As soon as the freighters were unloaded on the docks of Miami and New York, the heroin was trucked to pizza parlors owned by the Gambino crime family in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The parlors became the centers of heroin distribution throughout much of the eastern half of the country. The cash from the drug sales, deposited in amounts of less than $10,000, would flow from CIA-controlled banks, including Continental Illinois, Castle Bank and Trust, and Bank of Credit Commerce International (BCCI), to the IOR and the Vatican's chain of parochial banks throughout Italy. Eventually, the money laundering would come to involve many of the country's most prestigious financial firms, including Citibank, the Bank of New York, and the Bank of Boston. Yeah, all very interesting stuff that you can just present to anyone, and their response will be a shrug and a meh, what am I going to do about it? Guess I better get back to work making those same people richer. In 1979, the flood of heroin from Afghanistan inundated the United States, capturing over 60% of the market. In New York City alone, the mob sold 2 tons of smack, which registered a, quote, dramatic increase in purity. Heroin addiction in the States climbed back to 450,000. Within a year, street sales increased by 22%, and the addiction rate reached 500,000. The next section here is spoiled kids. The sons and grandsons of the mafia dons who had pioneered the heroin industry lived in extravagant houses, dressed in Armani suits, attended prestigious schools, and, strange to say, continued for the most part in the criminal tradition of their fathers and forefathers. After Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack in 1977, Paul Castellano, who had married Carlo's sister, became the head of the crime family. Thomas Costello, Carlo's son, became a capo in Manhattan, retaining the family's stranglehold on the trucking and garment industries. John, Joseph, and Rosario Gambino, Carlo's cousins, became the capos of the Inzerillo Gambino Spatola family. Paul Castellano's grandson, Paul, assumed control of the family's interest in illegal garbage hauling, while Frank Cowley, a nephew to the Gambino brothers, became a kingpin in the Gambino's heroin trade. But members of this generation didn't want to soil their hands with the business of the streets. Things like debt collection, prostitution, extortion, drug delivery to choice dealers and customers, and murder were beneath them. For the most part, their opulent lifestyles gave rise to an unnatural aversion to bloodletting, and it became increasingly easy to find reliable Italian and Sicilian immigrants who were willing to pick up the slack, especially within the inner cities. Yeah, this is like literally Godfather shit. Like all the stuff that you see in the Godfather movies doesn't sound far-fetched in any way whatsoever when you hear about these kind of, like the actual, what do they call it? The Corleonesi? They didn't really change it that much, that family. All right, how far am I in this one? All right, I'll do like 2 more minutes on this one. The Albanian Mafia. The new drug network rectified this growing problem. The couriers who brought the raw opium to Italy in trucks by the Balkan route were members of the Albanian Mafia, who did not flinch at committing random acts of violence. Within Italy, they began to perform much of the dirty work for the Camorra and the Ndrangheta along the coast of the Adriatic Sea. That family is particularly difficult. It's apostrophe Ndrangeta, Ndrangheta. Eventually, the Italian mafia no longer spoke of the Muslim Albanians as foreigners, but, quote, cari amici, or close friends. Throughout the 1980s, the Albanian thugs became the chief perpetrators of drug smuggling, counterfeiting, passport theft, forgery, trafficking in human body parts, sex slavery, abduction, and murder. The influence of the criminal group grew to such an extent that in 1985, Cataldo Mota, Italy's top prosecutor, said that the Albanian mafia posed a threat not only to the people of Italy, but to all of Western civilization. Wow. Next section here is New Gambino Goons. The Albanians proved so useful that they were imported by the Gambinos to serve as their enforcers. This makes you think of like Taken. Wasn't it literally Albanians that were in that movie as like the goons for all the mafia? Zef Mustafa became their chief, quote, clipper, or assassin. Mustafa's capacity for violence was only equaled by his capacity for liquor. He drank from morning to night, often consuming 2 or 3 quarts of vodka a day. His skills were matched by those of Abedin Dino Kolbiba, who mastered the art of making bodies disappear. The ruthless indifference of the Balkan newcomers to murder was evidenced by Simone and Victor Dede, 2 Gambino assassins. They shot a waiter at the Scores restaurant in New York City to express their displeasure at the quality of the service. For good measure, they also shot the bouncer before he could utter a word of protest. The arrival of the so-called, quote, Muslim mafia in Italy and the United States was an unexpected offshoot of the new network and the establishment of the Balkan route. By 2004, the FBI announced that the ethnic Albanians had replaced La Cosa Nostra as the, quote, leading crime outfit in the United States. That's crazy. And it's like also just the, it's got like everything that Americans are scared of. It's like Balkan people, so post-Soviets, they're Muslim, apparently. They're just foreigners to begin with, so that's scary. And they're probably going to be, what's the word, swarthy? They're probably not going to be like very pale in complexion. So that's going to scare people. Just really funny that these would be like the guys who end up being the scary mafia force at this time. It's very perfect for like all the media. And it's also kind of funny that it didn't get picked up till like what, the mid 2000s. That's a movie like Taken gets making. A movie like Taken gets made about this stereotype of mafiosi. It's kind of funny. All right, so I think I'm going to bookmark this one here. We will pick up tomorrow on chapter 13, the shell game. And for now, I'll switch over to the Western Marxism book. So in 1832, Thomas R. Dew, an influential ideologue of the South, declared, without any embarrassment, indeed not without pride, that Virginia was a, quote, Negro-raising state, and that it could export 6,000 per year. A planter boasted that his female slaves were, quote, breeding animals of extraordinary purity. Among the slave owners, a widespread means of increasing their capital was the encouragement of frequent childbirth and promoting births in general. Girls often were mothers at age 13 or 14, and by 20 had already brought 5 children into the world. They might even be emancipated after enriching their master with 10 or 15 small slaves. It was a practice that did not escape the attention of Karl Marx, who analyzed the situation on the eve of secession. Some entire states specialized in the, quote, breeding of slaves instead of traditional exports. These states raised slaves as goods for export. It was the triumph of biopolitics. If the conquistadors had recourse to a private biopolitics, but one always tolerated and encouraged by political power, now we instead find biopolitics in its second phase, practiced according to precise norms and regulations. We see here a state biopolitics and a state racism. Here we find the state, quote, the power, concerned with, quote, biological processes of the whole, quote, take possession of life, and in the most radical fashion imposing a, quote, drastic break between what must live and what must die, which transforms biopolitics into a practice of death. The breeding of black people goes hand in hand with the deportation and decimation of the indigenous peoples. It is a break that is reproduced within the blacks themselves. How many were suspected of putting in danger the, quote, security of the whole, to use Foucault's term, and so were considered unfit to live and were put to death, the others being thereby stimulated to increase and multiply themselves in slavery. Later, at the start of the 20th century, John A. Hobson, the honest English liberal whose work Lenin amply utilized in his writing on imperialism, summarized the biopolitics of the capitalist and colonialist West. The populations that survived, and indeed are even led to increase their numbers, were those that could be reduced to, quote, the economic exploitation of white colonists, while the others, quote, tend to disappear, or to be more precise, were decimated and annihilated. There is no mention in Foucault of this central chapter of the history of biopolitics, the chapter on colonialism. Moreover, his silence does not stop here. Even in the capitalist metropoles, an excessive and unproductive population was present. This too was unneeded ballast in the form of the, quote, Indians. A similar fate awaited them as well. This was the viewpoint expressed clearly by Benjamin Franklin, who, regarding the indigenous peoples, observed, quote, and indeed, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. It has already annihilated all the tribes who formerly inhabited the seacoast. 6 years earlier, Franklin had warned a physician in the following terms, quote, half the lives you save are not worth saving, as being useless, and almost the other half ought not to be saved, as being mischievous. Does your conscience never hint to you the impiety of being in constant warfare against the plans of Providence? Biopolitics reserved an analogous radical treatment for the capitalist metropole's external and internal ballast. As we have seen stated for the Indians, it was also for the, quote, Indians of the metropoles that sovereign biopolitics separated that life, quote, worth saving from that of the others, or as Foucault puts it, what must live and what must die. More than a century after Benjamin Franklin, Nietzsche pronounced, quote, the annihilation of the decadent races and the annihilation of millions of failures. Yeah, just again describing the terms in which capitalists and imperialists use, like terms in which they describe actual imperialism. They always cloak it in these terms of like, oh, we're just getting rid of the undesirables. We're getting rid of the people who are not workers, who are mischievous, who are going against our values, meaning not willing to be subjected to slavery, exploitation, annihilation. And they're continuing to do that. And they will continue to do that because No one's presenting any alternative or incentivizing them not to. Biopolitical preoccupation pervades every aspect of capitalist society. How can it assure itself the docile and submissive workforce that capitalism requires? Sieyès dreamed of resolving social conflict by promoting the coupling of black people and anthropomorphic apes, who hoped that from it could come forth a race of slaves by nature. More realistically, Jeremy Bentham proposed to enclose in quote workhouses together with their vagabond parents, children of tender age to have them couple and generate quote an indigenous class, used to work and discipline. It would have been, assured the English liberal, quote, the most gentle of revolutions, a sexual one, or to use the language common to our own days, a biopolitical one. From this ideological and politically backward terrain, we can understand the invention in England of, quote, eugenics, a new science that in Europe saw mass diffusion and application. Even this second chapter of the history of biopolitics, that which is strictly capitalist, is ignored by Foucault. He pays no attention to the third chapter either, which we can refer to by the term geopolitics. Indeed, this term emerged after the First World War, coined by the Swede Rudolf Kjellin. We are in 1920. The climate was clearly affected by dismay over the dimensions of the carnage only recently terminated, so much so that the peace just concluded appeared to many as a mere armistice, a prelude to a gigantic new test of force and a new slaughter. On the other hand, after the appeal launched by the October Revolution and Lenin to the quote slaves of the colonies to break their chains, there was widespread distress in the West over the anti-colonial revolution that loomed on the horizon, which had already begun. In these circumstances, the prolific character of the colonial peoples, rather than growing the number of slaves or semi-slaves, risked multiplying the potential enemies of the West and the great colonialist powers. Hence the widespread denunciation in the United States and Europe of those who tolerated abortion or the decline in birth rates. There was no lack of others who posed a terrible question. While total mobilization was underway in the economic sphere, was it worth wasting resources to treat incurably sick people who could only be a weight on society in the near war on the horizon? Or would it be better to round them up to increase their number and improve the conditions of the real and potential combatants? Clearly, politics had become biopolitical. The three chapters we have spoken of here can be distinguished conceptually, but are not chronologically separate. Let's see what happened in England in the years before the First World War. One of the experts of the Royal Commission mandated to study the problem of the quote weak-minded warned that they quote lower the general vigor of the nation and even threaten it with a quote national destruction. Circulated widely by Churchill, the report recommended energetic measures, forced sterilization of the quote weak-minded, or of the misfits, of the presumed habitual delinquents. The quote idle vagabonds would be enclosed in work camps. Only in this way could the country adequately confront quote a national and racial peril that it is impossible to exaggerate. Sometime earlier, Churchill had confided to one of his cousins, quote, the betterment of the British breed is the political objective of my life. The scholar who analyzed this chapter of history comments that as Home Secretary in 1911, quote, Churchill wanted a more draconian scheme that would give him personally almost unlimited power over the lives of some individuals. Of these three chapters of the history of biopolitics, there is no trace in Foucault, who uses the term biopolitics as if he had invented it himself. In effect, he radically reinvented it. The category biopolitics now came to stand alongside that of totalitarianism. The aim was to bring together Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Germany, at times adding to the list of the condemned even socialism as such, and the welfare state. Hayek proceeded analogously, accusing the supporters of any form of socialism and those who supported the welfare state of, quote, totalitarianism. Once again, notwithstanding his celebrity and radical posturing, Foucault largely ended up with the dominant ideology. It goes without saying that the more fully he ended up there, the more radical was his erasure of the history of colonialism. So now we're on to Chapter 9, From Foucault to Agamben, via Levinas. Giorgio Agamben enters the ranks of the noted philosophers of Western Marxism, sometimes juxtaposed with Horkheimer and Adorno, or Alain Badiou. He is a co-author of collectively written books with some of the most prestigious exponents of Western Marxism. Here I want to address only the important contribution that he has made to the destruction of the links between Western Marxism and the anti-colonial revolution, and therefore I refer only to its introduction to the Italian edition, 2012, of Some Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism, a 1934 work by Emmanuel Levinas. It consists of a few pages that directly address my work's central theme. The elegy pronounced by Agamben is high and solemn praise. Quote, this text by Levinus is perhaps the only successful attempt of the 20th century philosophy to come to terms with the decisive political event of the century, Nazism. What does it consist of? According to the author celebrated here, Hitlerism negates the foundation of, quote, liberalism, of, quote, Western civilization, of the, quote, Western spirit, and, quote, the structure of thought and the truths of the Western world. It rejects the thesis of the, quote, unconditional freedom of man before the world, of the, quote, sovereign freedom of treason. Nazism instead counters with, quote, the biological, with all the fatality that involves, the mysterious voice of blood and the idea of race. When did this perversion that seeks to question, quote, the traditional thought of the West begin? The answer, Marxism, for the first time in Western history, contests this conception of man. Far from recognizing, quote, absolute freedom, that which accomplishes miracles, Marx holds that, quote, being determines consciousness in such a way that he, quote, catches European culture off guard, or at least he breaks the harmonious curve of its development. It is the beginning of the catastrophe that culminates in Nazism. Historical materialism paved the way for biological racism. Traditionally, Marx and the political movement that takes his name have been accused of the opposite motive, of abandoning themselves to the hubris of reason and praxis by engaging in adventurous experiments in social engineering to construct a society and a world that would be radically new. In this critique, there is a grain of truth. Every great revolutionary movement tends to underestimate the weight and the resistance of objective social conditions, to exalt sometimes in extreme ways the role of praxis, and to fall into what I have defined as, quote, the idealism of practice. This is not by accident. In prison, driven by the desire to mislead the fascist censors and needing synonyms for Marxism and historical materialism, Gramsci writes of the, quote, philosophy of praxis, certainly not of the philosophy of being. But to demonstrate his thesis of the continuity between historical materialism and biological racism, Levinus does not hesitate to force things. He attributes to Marx the thesis according to which, quote, being determines consciousness, but does not waste time explaining which being is being referred to. So let's read a contribution to the critique of political economy. Quote, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being. On the contrary, their social being determines their consciousness. Social being is history, and so what sense does it make to compare this to the incessant mutations of blood, of biological nature celebrated by the champions of racism, as being synonymous with some eternal truth, and so end up justifying the errors, deviations, fantasies, and ideological mystifications of which the historical process is so rich in examples? The thesis of Levinus and Agamben is the reprisal of a common and outdated view, one already refuted in the late 19th century by an eminent representative of, quote, European civilization and the, quote, Western spirit. I am referring to Emile Durkheim. The great sociologist distinguished historical materialism from, quote, political and social Darwinism. Durkheim writes, the latter merely explains the development of institutions by the principles and concepts sufficient for explaining zoological development. Marx's theory is quite different. Quote, it seeks the motivating causes for historical development, not in the cosmic circumstances which may have affected the organism, but in the, quote, but in the environment which the labor of men in association has created from nothing and which has been added on to nature. It makes social phenomena depend not on hunger, thirst, sexual desire, etc., but on the state at which human art has arrived and the ways of living which have resulted from it. In short, on the collective works of men. I have highlighted in italics the terms in the passage above that constitute an earlier, direct refutation of the reading of Marx so dear to Levinus. Of course, from the latter's point of view, a philosophy that stresses the role of social being stands forever on a slippery slope. But Durkheim also has a reply to this objection. It is a central rule of the, quote, sociological method to not allow to enter into analysis the intentions and the conscious representations of individuals, but rather the situations, the relationships, the, quote, social facts. Indeed, it seems even to us on this condition, but only on this condition, that history may become a science and that sociology consequently may take on existence. It is a point on which the convergence with historical materialism is so great that the French sociologist adds, quote, for our part, we arrived at this postulate before we had learned of Marx, whose influence we had not at all suffered from. And thus, one of the greatest sociologists, an intellectual of Jewish origin in the Third Republic of France, would be co-responsible for the ruinous turn that resulted in Nazism. The thesis that stresses the role of, quote, material needs is nonsense, according to Levinas, both historically and philosophically. Marx placed himself on a slippery slope that led to the triumph of biological and racial materialism. The, quote, system of needs is a section of Hegel's Elements of Philosophy of Right, section 189, that begins by paying homage to this concept in political economy and to Smith, Say, and Ricardo. Levinas and Agamben risk pointing out as precursors to the Third Reich a considerable part of the pantheon of Western intellectuals. Lacking any philosophical basis, the arguments of Levinas and Agamben circulate in an entirely imaginary historical space. In the years that preceded this work of the French philosopher, the campaign that in the West raged against Marxism and against Bolshevism was conducted explicitly in the name of biology. For that wretched doctrine, quote, the very existence of superior biological values is a crime. Quote, a battle to the death was underway, quote, between biology and Bolshevism. The latter not only furiously opposed, quote, the new eugenic truth and, quote, the new biological revelation, but assumed a, quote, anti-racial attitude and incited the colored races, requiring society in one way or another to unburden itself of failures. Over and over again, we're just seeing these philosophers just do the same fucking move, just with different words, different like wordy paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. We are watching these philosophers try and just do horseshoe theory. That's all they're fucking doing is just doing horseshoe theory. And you realize that like that is still what's going on today. All of the people who are supposed critics of both Beijing and Washington, and all they do is criticize China, and they don't criticize Washington at all. They just repeat all of Washington's criticism about Beijing or Moscow or Tehran. This is literally all these people do is horseshoe theory. They try to say that every enemy of the West and Western colonialism is equally as bad as the West and Western colonialism, or as bad as the U.S. Do we see what everyone except for Marxists is now? They're just apologists for fascism. Catastrophe can be foiled only by reaffirming, by every means, biological truth against the ravings of Marxists and Bolsheviks. Expressing himself this way, we find an American intellectual celebrated by two U.S. presidents, Warren G. Harding and Herbert Hoover, and then solemnly welcomed to Berlin by Hitler. These were the years in which the regime of white supremacy dominant in the U.S. South exercised such an attraction to Nazism that its principal ideologue spoke of the North American Republic as a, quote, splendid country of the future that had the merit of having formulated the happy, quote, new idea of a racial state, an idea that should be put into practice, quote, with the strength of youth in Germany itself, enforcing it against not only black and yellow peoples, but also against Jews. As we see, it makes no sense to contrast the liberal West with Marxist and Nazi biological determinism. The chapter of history we have discussed here is imperially ignored by Levinas and Agamben, who deduce a priori the meaning of the Third Reich from an idea that pretends to be profound, but which, entirely abstracted from real history, is entirely empty. Yeah. What's up, Petrocell? Petrocell says, do not ask Foucault what he thinks of the age of consent. Pretty average for anti-communist, though. Yeah, that is very true. Foucault, I think, is another one of those guys who was on like some notorious letter arguing against the age of consent. There was like a whole bunch of French philosophers who signed on to this. It's like super fucking embarrassing for French philosophers. While on the one hand, they paint a caricature of historical materialism, on the other, Levinas and Agamben offer a vision of the Third Reich that we could define as Hollywood-esque. The Nazis are immediately recognizable for their crudeness, intent only on speaking of blood, race, and arms, and entirely incapable of articulating a discourse that references inferiority, soul, spiritual, or cultural values. In reality, having already refuted those stereotypes are the great intellectuals who are attracted to the Third Reich, Heidegger, Schmidt, etc. Above all, one must reflect on the personality of the Führer himself. As the most authoritative biographers have made clear, from the years of his earliest development, he cultivated, quote, the dream of a great artist. The most brutal exercise of power did not prevent him from excluding from the list of authentic leaders those who were without any artistic sensibility, nor from making appeals to teachers to work hard to, quote, arouse in men the instinct for beauty. It was, quote, what the Greeks considered essential. The Nazi bosses did not disdain paying homage to moral conscience, to the, quote, voice perceptible in silence, of which Goethe and Kant wrote, or to the, quote, categorical moral law, or even to, quote, freedom, to the quote feeling of responsibility or to the culture of the soul that it implied. As long as the colonial peoples were excluded from the civil community, moral community, and human community. And so, a policy of enslavement of servile races and of annihilation of Jewish Bolshevik agitators that incite them to an insane revolt could go hand in hand with paying homage to the categorical imperative and the celebration of the moral, artistic, cultural, and spiritual values of the West and of the white and Aryan race. So, if we want to understand the Third Reich, we must start with the reprise and the radicalization of the colonialist tradition and of the racism intrinsic to it. That is, with the very problem ignored and erased by Levinas and Agamben. Yeah, it's almost like when these Western philosophers start from the starting point that the West is good, that people in the West are free, that one of the Western values of liberalism is equality, while they ignore the very real inequality, then it's almost like everything they say after that point is bullshit and apologetics for fascism. So I'm going to bookmark this one here, and now we'll pick up on The Soviets Expected It by Anna Louise Strong. So we last left off talking about the Urals, the Ural Mountains in Russia. Behind the Urals, one may distinguish at least 5 great regions: the Urals themselves, Siberia, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and the Far East. Each of them could carry on a fairly protracted war and feed and clothe itself while doing it. All the 5 regions are connected by railway lines, which are independent of European Russia. Any of these 5 regions is nearly the size of all of Western Europe. Taken together, they are several times the size of Europe. The mightiest of these regions consists of the Urals themselves taken together with Siberia, which adjoins on the east. These two together form a self-sufficient empire somewhat larger than all of Western Europe and with natural resources probably greater. It is protected from invasion by 2,000 miles of European Russia to the west and by equal or greater distances to the south and east. It forms a tremendous base in the heart of the Soviet country, from which streams of war supplies can be sent in any direction. It specializes in the production of war necessities, from tanks and munitions to canned meat, powdered milk, and wheat. And I can only imagine that all of this is still even much more the case. It's not like Russia has just like stopped building things. I know there was a great period of deindustrialization after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but that was 40 fucking years ago. On the western edge of this region lies Magnitogorsk, maybe. It looks like Magnitogorsk, or Magnet. Okay, so it is Magnet Mountain in the southern Urals. Its single mountain of iron is enough to supply all Soviet consumption for more than a generation. I visited the city in the days of its building and saw a raw industrial town arising through titanic struggle on the dry and naked steppe 500 miles away from any other city. The town dealt in superlatives. Every one of its accessory plants was, quote, the biggest ever known. Today, Magnitogorsk is the world's second largest iron and steel producer, being outranked only by Gary when Gary is producing at peak. Do they mean Gary, Indiana? Wow, that's depressing because Gary is now known as like the epitome of like the Dust Bowl of like the deindustrialization of the U.S. So Gary is like a shithole. During American depressions, Magnet Mountain beats Gary. Okay, so I guess Magnet Mountain is beating Gary still. 1,000 miles east of Magnet Mountain lies the Kuznets Basin, Kuzbas for short, one of the world's greatest coal deposits. I visited it 3 times and saw its new steel city being dug by steam shovels out of the mud. It is nearly as large as Magnitogorsk and in some details beats it. The cities are cheerful rivals, competing in steel production, parks, and football. In the early days, they exchanged coal and iron ore. Cars shuttled back and forth on a 1,200-mile line, taking coal one way and iron ore the other. With later rationalization, this haul was found too long. Iron ore was located near Kuzbas, and coal deposits were found nearer to Magnitogorsk for much of the two regions' needs. Between Magnet Mountain and Kuznetsk lie the grain fields of western Siberia, one of the world's most famous sources of wheat. Its production has been increased much faster than that of any other part of the USSR, through the plowing of virgin lands. Throughout the whole of this vast region, many great industrial cities have arisen, including some of the largest and most modern machinery plants in the world. Uralmash, making steel mill machinery, claims to be the world's largest. So does the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, where Caterpillar tractors and therefore tanks are made. The largest railroad car works in the USSR is at Tagilsk in the Urals. Three of the largest locomotive works are in 3 different cities in this great area. Nor are other industries neglected. All the necessities of life are produced here, from food processing, textile spinning, and paper production to cement, chemicals, shoes, and every kind of metal object. Pretty cool. So yeah, like literally talking about, I think I've mentioned it before reading this book. They're not even just doing socialism in one country. They're doing like socialism in separate areas of this big multi-country nation. The Ural-Siberian Empire connects by rail with two great regions south of it, Kazakhstan and Central Asia. The line is the famous Turk-Sib Railway, completed in 1930 and the first to open all of the great projects of the first 5-year plan. It runs through deserts far behind the Urals, 2,000 miles away from the western battlefront. Twice in the past 11 years, I have visited the Turk-Sib Railway. I guess that means the Turk-Siberian Railway, and they abbreviate it. I went with 60 journalists from all the world by special train to the tremendous celebration that marked its opening, the joining of the north and south sections of the line. Our train ran by no schedule. There was no schedule on the line, for this was its first train. Ahead of us on new laid rails swayed our festival locomotive, painted green and flaming with inscriptions. Quote, "Strengthen the might of the USSR. May Day 1930. Gift of Aliata workers to Turk Sib." It was a gift by volunteer workers who had overhauled it in spare time without wages. In reward, a volunteer crew from the Aliata repair shops had the honor of taking the first Turk Sib train. All afternoon at the rail joining a Russian Kazakh festival went on. One of the chief stunts was to put a Russian and a Kazakh together in a great iron bucket and swing them 60 feet in air by the crane that normally handled the bucket filled with sand. A great crowd screamed and thrilled. On the football field, the teams of Siberia and Turkestan contended till dusk. I was caught and all but killed in one of the wild celebrations of Kazakh horsemen who had journeyed weeks on horseback to see the, quote, great iron horse traverse their desolate land. I was walking with a friend across a valley and looked up to see 1,000 horsemen riding down upon us in a mad cavalry charge, swaying drunken with speed in their saddles, looking neither ahead nor left nor right. We saved our lives by facing the oncoming horses and with authoritative gestures commanding the animals, not their ecstatically oblivious riders, to diverge. They split and went by on both sides of us, sometimes only a few inches away. When it was over, I had a shock of terror from the reckless power of this untamed land. 10 years later, in December 1940, I came back to Kazakhstan on the Turksib Railway to take the new airplane route from Alma-Ata to China. I was the first American to travel by this route. It took 5 days on a fast train, on a fast through train, to go from Moscow to the capital of Kazakhstan. On the second day out, we traversed the Volga Valley and saw wheat fields by the tens of thousands of acres, the largest grain farms in the world. Fields of fresh sprouts swept green to the horizon, followed by equal fields of black fallow land. On the second night, as the land grew steadily drier, we skirted the southern Urals and came to the old Tsarist fortress town, Orenburg, gateway to Soviet Asia and Kazakhstan. Over the noisy crowds blared a noisier station radio, shouting out music and news. The bookstall offered thick tomes on road building, courses for tractor drivers, technical minimum for railway mechanics, tales of the Arctic, the young naturalist, changes in the constitution of the Communist Party, and La Littérature Internationale, a monthly journal in French. In the palm-decorated dining room, they served an uninteresting but nourishing meal of soup, meat, macaroni, and fruit compote. Orenburg Station boasted a barbershop, a drugstore, a first aid room, and a mother's and baby's restroom on the second floor. Gangs of women were loading powdered coal into cars, and a man at the platform buffet was hewing loaves of bread in half with a big cleaver to insert inch-thick slabs of heavy meat in a sort of giant sandwich. After this impact of raw, virile life, we drew into empty country. Between long miles, we passed occasional villages drowned under seas of mud. Then the land grew emptier still, dotted with herds of sheep and cattle. 5 days in all, and most of it vacant land. Twice in these endless lands I woke up at night to see flames of factories and hear the roaring of metal plants or oil refineries. Somewhere north of the Aral Sea, somewhere near Emba, a new oil city blazed in the dark. I recalled that Emba is probably the greatest oil deposit in the world, largely undeveloped, but the latest figures given before the Second World War put a censorship on figures. indicate that these oil regions southeast of the Urals now produce 21% of the Soviet Union's total. I only know that I saw the flaring lights of a fair-sized industrial city, so new that it was listed neither in the railway timetable nor on the map. So yeah, talk about like new industry, new development, literally having cities that aren't even on the map yet. They're not on the railway map. They're not on schedule. But you're going through. You're seeing them regardless. They're obviously existing. People are operating there. And again, just to reiterate over and over again, like how self-sufficient all these places are, and how self-sufficient the Soviet Union could be overall with all these various places, so rich in resources, all this land that they had to take advantage of. It's like almost no wonder they beat the Nazis. In the last few hours of the journey, a yellow-skinned Kazakh youth of 26 got into my compartment. He was much excited to learn that I had seen the Turk-Sib railway at its beginning. He said, "I was a boy of 13 when they started to build the railway, a starving shepherd boy who had never been to school. I came to beg for a job on the road, and they put me in the railway school and fed me and trained me. When the Turk-Sib opened, I was 16, fit for a semi-skilled job. I kept on working and studying. The railway gives you every chance. Now at 26, I have a good job in the maintenance department. Turk-Sib is my father and my life." In Alma-Ata, I met the Kazakhstan patriots. Not since boom days in California have I heard such cheerful local bragging as I heard from the local editors who called upon me at the airport. They presented me first with all 7 massive volumes, sumptuously bound. Quote, "Published last spring for the 20th anniversary of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Kazakhstan," they told me. Pictures of wheat fields and cotton fields, and tractors and oil wells and copper refineries were bound together with stupendous statistics and salted down with plentiful lyrics by Kazakh poets in praise of Stalin, the USSR, first love, springtime, and Kazakhstan. These Kazakhstaners saw Moscow as, quote, "the center," where they met with other republics to settle plans and budgets. But Kazakhstan itself was something too. Quote, "I have been in Berlin and I have lived in London. Neither of them is as good a town as Alma-Ata. We have the greenest town in the whole of USSR, or in the whole USSR." Such was the cheerful brag of Comrade Orostov, editor-in-chief of the Kazakhstan Pravda. He almost made a virtue of the mud of the road in which his auto got stuck on the way to the airport. It proved the newness of the airport and the bigness of Kazakhstan. Quote, "We have so many roads to build," he told me. "This one will be well paved by spring." Yeah, imagine being like that optimistic about the development that like you get your car stuck in the mud and you're like, "Oh, it just shows how new our town is. Look how fast we're developing. We can't even pave the roads fast enough." But don't worry, it will be. Quote, "Kazakhstan has more than 1 million square miles," he continued. "It is bigger than the 14 chief European countries taken together. We are the biggest republic in the Union. We reach from the Ural Mountains to China, from the snows of the Siberian Altai to the blue Caspian Sea. We have everything: wheat, livestock, cotton, every kind of mineral. In copper, we are first in the Union. In coal, the third. Our Academy of Science is exploring our so-called desert areas. Already they have found 240 million acres of tillable vacant land. Much of it, of course, needs irrigation, but the wastelands have resources of minerals. Our factories are developing. Our industrial production has already surpassed our farm products in value. We have 13 times the industrial production that Kazakhstan had in Tsarist days." And again, this is all just reminding me of like how many times I keep seeing articles about China greening deserts, like quite literally irrigating entire vast swaths of land that used to be deserts, and then they turned it into agriculture, forests. They turned it into green areas, quite literally greening deserts. Just Google China greening deserts at what cost, and you'll get all the American articles. Let's see how much longer do I have here. Oh yeah, I got like 5 more minutes. Let's see. So Kazakhstan, land of nomad horsemen, was already boasting of its industrialization. "Our young folks built 500 miles of railway last summer," said Orostov, quote, "to connect Magnitogorsk iron with Karaganda coal. This cuts in half the long haul of coal that they used to get from Kuznetsk. It was built by our young Communist League, 500 miles in one summer. We consider it quite a record here. We are building another now to the oil fields near Emba." Alma-Ata, the capital of this area, has grown from a town of 60,000 to a proud young city of 260,000 in the 10 years since railroad reached it. Its life has leaped at once from the nomad epoch to the airplane. The railroad is too slow to tame the wastes of Kazakhstan. From Alma-Ata Airport to the planes shoot forth east, west, south, north on new discoveries. They survey the copper, coal, oil of a vast empire where herdsmen roamed 10 years ago. After they find new riches, they build the roads to get them. The Alma-Ata Press featured especially the building of railroads and irrigation ditches and the industrial achievements of the Chimkent lead workers, the Kazakhstan sugar workers, the Karaganda coal miners. Kazakhstan is the only one of the energetic regions behind the Urals. Oh, sorry, is only one of the energetic regions behind the Urals. South of it lie the lands of the Uzbeks and Tajiks, who were some of the largest where some of the largest textile mills of the USSR work up the locally grown cotton, and where automobile and airplane parts are produced by mass production in the historic city of Samarkand. North of Kazakhstan is the far greater Ural-Siberia region that I have already described. Each of these three great regions could live and defend itself for a long period on its own resources. All of them taken together are a mighty supply base, 2,000 miles north and south, which can send war supplies by any one of several channels to any part of the Soviet land. And again, we can't forget how, in the early chapters, we've described exactly how much difficulty the Germans had at trying to conquer any of these places. So you might think, well, if they have this huge land that's just packed with resources and industrial production infrastructure, why wouldn't the Germans just target that? Why wouldn't they just take over some of the, I don't know, central authorities of this area and then control those same resources? And we have to remember that it doesn't work that way. Even if you were to take out the heads of the industries, if you were to take out the leaders, the political leaders, whoever, you would not control that land. You would not control those resources. You would not control those buildings. You would not control that infrastructure. The Soviets were well informed, were well versed, were very familiar with how to operate all of these things without any top-down direction. Not only were they communists, they were able to adapt and be horizontalists when they needed to. It's just that communism is superior to anarchism and liberalism in every possible way. 10 days east of Moscow by fast express lies Vladivostok. It is the longest rail journey in the world. It takes twice as long as the fast steamers once took from New York to Europe. Fast steamers once took from New York to Europe. Here in the Soviet Far East, it is another tremendous region so far away from European Russia that it seems almost impossible, almost like a different country. Here also are the same Soviet people. Because of the great distance from Moscow, they are defended by two special Far Eastern Red Armies with a completely separate organization of personnel and war supplies. For the past 10 years, the drive to develop for the Far East has been promoted by Soviet press and organizations. It has attained proportions similar to that which once built the American Far West. I have traveled many times on the Trans-Siberian. In the spring of 1935, I went from Vladivostok to Moscow with a stopover in the Jewish Autonomous Territory, whose capital is Birobidzhan. Another great episode of Proles Pod, Stalin was a mensch. It's pretty much the whole episode is mostly about Birobidzhan and how Stalin gave them this whole area. And of course, the Westerners had to propagandize and say that they were expelling them there and holding them in concentration camps or something. The train was crowded with pioneering people in warm woolen clothes and padded leather jackets, engineers, army men, developers of the Far East. The 21-year-old girl who shared my compartment and sat mouse-like for several days turned out at last to be a traffic technician. For 2 years, she had lived in a railway car while working to help build the second track of the Trans-Siberian. She showed me with shy pride the picture of her graduating class and pointed out a stalwart youth who was standing beside her in the photograph. "He is my special friend," she said. "We planned to come east together, but they gave him another assignment. We're meeting now in Leningrad to get married." The wife of a Red Army commander was going back to her 2-year-old baby, who lives with its grandmother during the 6 months of each year that the wife spends with her husband in the Far East. A young woman coal mining technician, aged 25, was going to a mining conference in Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk? Yeah. At one station, passengers arrived from the gold fields. At another, we received members of a geological survey. An army engineer who shared my table at dinner was celebrating his return by airplane from the northern wilderness by consuming a whole bottle of port and bragging about the Far Eastern pioneers. For thousands of miles of sparsely settled wilderness, the Soviet borders march with those of Manchukuo. Let's see. The wide Amur River serves as boundary line to separate the Soviet settlers from the territory where, even as I passed through, Japanese troops were burning villages whose Chinese inhabitants had dared to resist. On the Soviet side of the border, the Red Army maintained very close relations with the new settlers. The army transport often helped take them to their farming homes, while army horses and men came in organized groups to help the farmers get in the harvest. So yeah, just a quick passing mention of the Chinese people fighting the Japanese Imperial Army and how they were literally just burning the villages of Chinese people who dared to resist. At the railway station, at the railway station book stands, quantities of military books were on sale. There were no emotional books about the quote yellow peril or the Japanese menace. There were solid tomes on field tactics of the Japanese army, tanks, proposed systems of artillery, all with copious diagrams and illustrations. A textbook of 1,000 pages entitled Foreign Armies described with hundreds of diagrams the organization and tactics of every important military force in the world. A popular journal, War Tactics Abroad, consisted of articles culled from foreign military publications. All of it was as cool as a problem in engineering. It was a library for a military academy. Quote, I suppose you sell these books to Red Army commanders, I said to the young woman in charge of the stand. Quote, the general population buys a lot of them, she answered. The farmers study them in study courses. Our defense is not merely a matter of the regular army, but of all citizens. Again, reminding us of how you can't just take over these areas. Like, again, it was mentioned early in this book how the Nazis just rolled over France because the French people were so worried about their property and property rights in general because they had a capitalist society that when the Germans rolled into town, they would maybe kill a few people, take whatever leaders they needed hostage or whatever, but they just usurped all the stuff. And nobody wanted to burn down their own things. They were worried about it. They concerned for their property, so they wouldn't destroy anything. And then the Germans would just take it. Whereas the Soviets, if the Germans came in, they would burn their own shit. They would burn down their own farms, burn down their own houses, fully secure in the knowledge that the Soviet Union would rebuild it for them once the war was won, which they did do. The Germans literally could not take shit from the Soviets. Small industries were already starting in the Jewish autonomous territory. They have grown very greatly since that day. Contrary to most belief abroad, Azerbaijan was not planned primarily for agricultural development, though farming also flourishes with the help of an agricultural experiment station and several tractor stations. The region's chief destiny is to become an industrial district, producing consumers' goods for the whole Soviet Far East, a task which especially fits the capacities of the great belt of Jews that live on the Soviet Union's western borders. Since Hitler's invasion, many Jewish refugees have gone to Azerbaijan. The population contains skilled artisans unused to modern machines but skilled in crafts. They test out the local materials of Azerbaijan, make sample products, then get big orders and credits from Khabarovsk, the Far Eastern capital, and develop factories. The Soviet Far East provides a hungry market for everything they make. I recall a small group of bentwood furniture makers who, after completing with much pain a dozen samples of bentwood chairs, were appalled by an order from Khabarovsk for 5,000 chairs as soon as they can be made. In a flimsy structure that was still more than half in the open air, a group of artisans were making the first farmers' carts for the new settlers. They proudly pointed out the pattern. Quote, 2 types, they said, both of them Army standard from the Moscow Bureau of Standards. They are the best and strongest model, and in case of need, every farmer of the Far East will at once become a part of a completely standardized army transport. So yeah, they don't only have like effective and useful things for all their people to do, but then backup plans for those same useful, productive forces that they're making in case of war, in case of aggression from the capitalists. And you wonder why it's just a better system. All right, so I'm at 1 hour and 4 minutes. I'm a little over, it's fine. Didn't realize. All right, so I'm going to bookmark this one here. But as always, I will pick up next time. We'll read some more about the Gladio book, which is Unholy Alliance by Paul L. Williams. We'll read more of Western Marxism by Domenico Losurdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill, and Anna Louise Strong's book, The Soviets Expected It. Thank you all for joining. Appreciate you hanging